I want to start by saying this. Everything coexists within a watershed. Households, businesses, industries, agriculture, plants, animals, microbes, you name it. Throughout my human ecological journey, I've come to see and study life through the lens of watersheds, with water as a fundamental ingredient for life at the focus of it. We all live in one, we all depend on one, and we all affect it in one way or another. So, what exactly is a watershed? A watershed can be defined as all the land that drains into the same location or body of water. Think of it as a funnel, collecting all the water within a specific area and draining it to the nearest body of water. Drop by drop, this water flows through creeks and rivers and streams to eventually reach bays, lakes, or the final flush, which is the ocean. Or it may take a very different route and infiltrate to the soil, feed aquifers, and eventually flow out through natural springs. Now, you probably remember learning in elementary school about the water cycle, but you probably took all the services, the ecological services they give us for granted, such as drinking water, clean air, irrigation, energy, recreation, flooding control, pollution filtering, just to name a few. And how we take advantage of these services largely determines the scheme of this utopian-looking diagram. This is where things get complicated. And this cycle becomes what Surfrider Foundation calls the cycle of insanity. The real story of water. We're cutting down forests, we're building over wetlands, depleting our aquifers, eroding precious soil away, causing sediment pollution, pumping water over thousands and thousands of miles from Fiji or the Alps, even injecting water into bedrock for our precious fossil fuels. We're building large-scale dams to affect the entirety of a river system and displace people. We're dumping stuff in our waters that other species are like, what are plastics? What is this? We're affecting the biogeochemical processes of carbon, which you can see here, we're dumping into the atmosphere, nitrogen and phosphorus, which flows into bays and cause algae blooms at rates we've never seen before. And on top of this, 1 billion people still don't have access to clean water, and 2.3 billion don't have access to sanitation from this water. Population growth, urban development, climate change are the most serious threats to watersheds worldwide. And we're rapidly driving them to the edge of collapse. But don't panic yet. What if we start from scratch? What if we started designing with nature instead, working with the river system rather than against them? We cannot use the same system that got us into this mess to solve this. What if we organize based on watersheds? This is what it would look like. All these lines are 100% scientific, based on digital elevation models. So these lines were not drawn by anybody, only by topography. If we take a closer look, you can see the Congo River Basin and the Nile River Basin becoming the powers of Africa. The huge rivers in Russia draining to the Arctic Sea. The Amazon, the lung of the world, the Amazon watershed and the Paraná River watershed. And then we get to the United Watersheds of America. You can quickly spot the Mississippi River in pink, the giant watershed, the biggest in North America. And since we're using the political boundary of the US, I'm going to bring out some big issues with this. The Rio Grande is split in half in Mexico, half in the US. Transboundary conflicts between the US and Mexico are huge in this case. Colorado River, same thing. Most of it in the US, but the delta is in Mexico, and they get mostly affected by it. The Columbia River starts in Canada and drains into Washington state, also another case of problems. The Great Lakes, what they do in the Great Lakes on this side affects what happens on the other side. So if we actually base ourselves in these borders, these conflicts would be greatly diminished. Second of all, with watershed boundaries, once powerless watershed committees acting as intermediaries between states will have a local say in local solutions for local problems, making implementation of restoration projects, monitoring and assessment of sustainability goals much straightforward. Each watershed can balance their water use and, more importantly, use it locally. Then land use coding and regulations can follow and start to reflect the needs of those local watersheds rather than those of special interest, which are not directly impacted by these actions. Some examples of this in reality is Oregon. Oregon has state agencies elected by community, they have elected community representatives for watershed councils and watershed districts, which do a bunch of watershed work within the state of Oregon. The same for Kansas and Minnesota. The Chesapeake Bay program in the Mid-Atlantic is probably the most ambitious watershed-wide program. It got put in a pollution diet. They have to comply with certain levels of nutrients and sediments on a daily basis. But furthermore, watershed boundaries would give back power not just to the rivers, but to indigenous tribes that settled on their banks for thousands of years. The Penobscot Nation, here you can see the Penobscot River in red within the New England region, recognize the Penobscot River as their lifeblood. You can see how this kind of resembles as arteries and veins, so it's not much to say. And they are literally the river. Indigenous notions of water and their inclusive decision-making process can help us build healthy and resilient watersheds based on informed local knowledge of landscapes. And now it's time to meet your watershed, the one you're standing on right now. Within the New England region, you can aggregate all these watersheds into the Gulf of Maine watershed. And within, you can see all the sub-watersheds, including the Penobscot and Kennebec. And they all drain, also in Canada, they all drain to the Gulf. So they're all this entity together. And if we zoom in into the Maine coastal region, we get to the Frenchman Bay watershed. And within this, we can see the minuscule COA watershed you're standing right now. But we're largely affecting it. This little watershed is 30% impervious with concrete, which triples the amount of runoff. 9% of solar energy comes from on-site. 70% of wastes are diverted in this watershed. We're the third water user in Bar Harbor. 2 million gallons of water taken from Eagle Lake. There's no rainwater collection at all. So that's a very off-budget balance. We're importing a minuscule part of produce, and we're producing 1,100 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which would be equal to 3 Eagle Lakes coverage of forests, consuming that carbon for a year. So, the watershed perspective recognizes that social, economic, and ecological sustainability can only be achieved through ambitious watershed-wide programs that strive for self-reliance, self-resiliency, energy independence, social equity, and climate justice, starting at the community level to eventually accomplish regional and global goals, one small watershed at a time. So, with this in mind, I invite you to meet your home watershed, get to know your home watershed, and become an actor of inclusive, constructive, real, and impactful change within it. Only then we can start living to the carrying capacity of our watersheds and reintegrating ourselves into the existing ecological machine. I'll have a booth during Earth Day on Saturday, so you can show up and you can actually meet your watershed, and I'll show some maps. So if you just give me a zip code, I can tell you your sphere of influence and how you affect it. And with that in mind, I invite you to double think your effects in your watershed next time you cross that bridge from Turrets to Deering. Thank you.